Well, with that, our speaker this month is Sara Straffer. She's the Sitgrave Zone Archaeologist of the Apache Sitgraves National Forest in Heber. And she's been working for the Forest Service for 13 years. So with that, are you ready to take over, Sara?
Sure. Now that I know it's being recorded, the pressure's on. All right.
So,
share my screen with you guys. So as Richard said, I am the Sitgreaves Zone Archaeologist over here on the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. And what that means is I oversee this side of the forest, the Heritage Program. So that runs all the way from the Lakeside District, way out near the Los Barrios Campground, if you know where that is, all the way out to past Heber and where 260 drops off the rim. So it's a very large area, and I have a great group of archaeologists that work under me that help us accomplish all the work that is required to cover that much area. I've been here for almost 6 years now. I'm going to leave my camera on because I talk with my hands. So if you guys want to see me talking with my hands, I'll just leave it on.
yes, we definitely want to see your picture.
So that's what's happening. And so what I'm going to be discussing today is a presentation that's kind of been in the works, and it is nowhere near where I want it to be, but it is a really good start. And what we're going to be talking about is the prehistory of the Mogollon Rim, and we're specifically focusing on the formative period. And what the formative period just means is that when people started to settle down and to become more sedentary. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation. There's a lot of new survey that has been completed in the past 5 or 6 years. We probably have over 50,000 acres of new survey that's been completed with hundreds of sites recorded. And so there are there's several hundred, if not more, pages of new documentation that we have in this area. And so I've started kind of compiling it and kind of creating a better picture so that we can analyze the settlement patterns of this area. And it's very early on in its stages. So once I get a better grasp and handle on that, I would love to give another presentation that kind of builds on this base presentation that I'm giving right now. With that, we're going to move forward and talk about the development of prehistoric communities along the rim. If I can get this going, there we go. So I wanted to start off with an overview of the prehistoric cultural regions of the Southwest and where we're going to be talking about. Let me get my, there we go, laser pointer. There we go. So clearly we're going to be talking about the Mogollon, and specifically we're going to be talking about the Mogollon Rim, which is right here. And it's a really interesting place. So the Mogollon Rim is the southern terminus of the Colorado Plateau. And I know I'm talking to a lot of you guys probably already know a lot of this. So, and then a side note, we'll take questions at the end, or anything that you guys want to talk about at the end, we can do that. So Mogollon Rim is the terminus of the Colorado Plateau. And the Colorado Plateau is this huge area right here, where my laser pointer is pointing. And it is basically that huge area where the ancestral Puebloans occupied. And previously they were known as Anasazi, but we call them the ancestral Puebloans now, because it's more PC, and it respects the different Puebloan tribes today, referring to it as ancestral Puebloan, because Anasazi is a Navajo word for my enemy. And so Ancestral Puebloan's a better option. So we're going to be focusing on this area right here, the terminus of the Colorado Plateau, where majority of us live. It's a very interesting area because all of our water from here goes to the north and feeds into the Little Colorado River, which then feeds into the Colorado River. And that's this system right here. And then it feeds into the Grand Canyon. One of the interesting things about this area and why I like living here so much is the archaeology is amazing. And one of the reasons why it's amazing is because it is a transition zone. So we have this transition between the lower highlands of the Mogollon, as well as the Hohokam, and we've got influences from the Sinagua, and then we have influences from the ancestral Puebloans. And so we've got all these different influences that are impacting this group, especially right in this area where we live. And we can see that in the architecture styles and in the cultural material, meaning the pottery and the other types of artifacts that we find in this area are all influenced from those different areas that it's surrounded by. Yeah, and one of the things that I've found interesting since I've been here is the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. The boundary kind of goes here, and then it follows along the boundary to the to New Mexico. And so you go down here and you see different architecture styles than what we see on the rim. Yet we consider up here Mogollon as well. And so it's a very different kind of style, but we see both influences from these lower highland Mogollon as well as ancestral Puebloan. So we might get into that. If I miss it, somebody can call me out and I can talk a little bit about the different architecture when we get there. Let's see. All right, so I'm not really going to talk a lot about the Archaic period, but I wanted to throw this in here so that you guys, just as a little bit of background. Also, if you've ever been in any of my presentations, you know I always have to have a jackalope. I have a jackalope sitting here on my desk that helps me. So I figured this was a prime spot to put a photo of a jackalope. So during the Archaic period in this area, it's a very broad range of dates. So it's about 8,000 BC to 8,200. And what's happening during this time period in this area is we've got very mobile groups of hunter-gatherers just surviving off the land. That's pretty much what they're doing in this area. We do see that corn has made its way up from Central America and from Southern America, and it looks different from the corn we have today, but we see it present in areas outside of Tucson. We see irrigation starting outside of Tucson during that time, and we don't see it up here, but they're not heavily farming. They're just kind of dabbling with it at this point down in southern Arizona. It's not something that's a staple food. It's not something that they are relying on. It's more of a, hey, let's plant this and we'll come back when it's ready to harvest type of deal. So it's a little bit of agriculture, but not quite full-blown farming and reliance. And so they do that for a couple, for 1,500 years, 1,000 years, before they kind of settle down and start really investing in farming, which we'll get to here in a second. Additionally, we see beans and squash kind of start making its way up after we see corn in the area. I'm sure most of you know that corns, beans, and squash are referred to as the three sisters, and they grow really well together. The beans help provide nitrogen, which helps fuels the corn, and so often they would plant all three of those together. Other thing about this time period is that technology is basically spears, so they are using atlatls, or basically spear throwers for hunting. And okay. So moving on, this is the formative period chronology. Some of you may have heard of the Pecos classification, which is right here. And so you've got words such as basket maker and Pueblo 1, Pueblo 2. So we have our own chronology here that we use on the Sitgreaves zone of the forest. And it's very specific to this area. It was developed by Hari. I think that's how you pronounce it, in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. He did a lot of work here, as well as just off the rim in Forestdale and Point of Pines. And he helped develop this chronology. And then through research that has occurred in this specific area along the rim, Barbara Mills and Sarah Hare's work with the Silver Creek project, they were able to fine tune it. And then after the Rodeo Chattiskai fire, there was a lot of large scale survey that was completed, and they were able to fine tune just a little bit more the chronology of the area. And so we use this revised chronology that Scott North, who at that point in time was working with SWCA, he with all that research was able to kind of fine tune some of our chronology. And so that's what I'm going to walk through today. Is we're going to walk through these different chronologies. So this is just kind of, I pulled it out. This is the chronology that we use. So I'm going to be discussing that, and we're going to kind of go through each phase and discuss those different changes and pushes and pulls that created kind of these different phases, and why we have divided these up into phases. All right, so the first phase is Hilltop, which is about 200 to 400 AD. I have added in the Pecos classification as well for those of you that are more familiar with that classification, so that you can refer to that. So during this time, it is the earliest recognized formative phase in the Mogollon Rim area. We don't have a lot of sites like this out here, but we do have some. So this was pre-pottery. So this is during the time that there's baskets and leather bags, and that's how they were kind of living. Baskets were often made of either bear grass or yucca, sumac, other flexible plants such as willow if it was available. And they would use baskets for everything, including cooking. Oftentimes, those baskets that they would use for cooking would be lined with pitch or some kind of sap to keep it from leaking. And then when they're ready to cook whatever plants or whatever they were making, they would heat up rocks and then throw the rocks in the basket, the waterproof basket, and that would help bring the water to a boil, and they could cook that way. So during this time, we're starting to see a slow transition to being a little bit more sedentary. So like I was saying earlier, some of these crops have been in the area for a while. They're making their way up here. And so people are becoming more sedentary. And we see this in the development of kind of small, shallow pit houses, as well as storage cysts or pits. And these small pit houses, let's see, we've got kind of a photo, not a drawing, not a photo, definitely not a photo, a drawing here of these pit houses. And it's really, they're very shallow. So imagine, I've had the opportunity to excavate a couple of pit houses from this time period. And we would jokingly call them flying saucer or UFO landing sites, because it's kind of that shallow kind of basin that you imagine that if a flying saucer landed, that's what you would see. So that's kind of what they looked like. And then you would have a fire pit in the middle, and then you'd have posts supporting the roof, which was cribbed and kind of wattle and daub. So this would all be this would all be adobe or daub. And sometimes, depending on where you're at, you would either enter from the side, coming from the side, which would also act as a vent shaft type of deal, and keep the smoke coming up through the center and from smoking you out, essentially. Some pit houses are from the top entrance. but I think that would be later. That's more of a later occurrence. But these shallow pit houses would be just like this. We also see, let's see. So we know, from the storage, the cysts that I was mentioning earlier, that they are kind of starting to invest a little bit more in farming. We also see shallow metates and monos. So this right here, normally they're one-handed bun-shaped monos is what we would call that, associated with these smaller metates. We also, during this time, see the introduction of the bow and arrow. I would say that this is one of the most important kind of tipping points for this time period would be the development of, or the bow and arrow coming up and making its way into this area, as well as the pit structures, because now you're establishing, you might still be hunting and gathering, but you're starting to become more settled and more sedentary, and you're increasing efforts in farming. So just because the bow and arrow was here during this time period, they were still utilizing the atlatl. And then my next slide is actually an example that I found on an example of one of these sites that I found on the forest early on when I was here. And it was exciting to me because these are the type of artifacts that I found at this site. So this site, clearly out in the pinyon juniper, and it was such a good example of this time period. There was one ceramic that had eroded down the hill slope of a different site, and it was all lithic. So it was all the debitage from making stone tools. There weren't any ceramics. We had this, it's kind of difficult to see, but there's this shallow basin metate, and we found these one-handed biscuit-shaped monos, and we have these atlatl spear points. So it's really exciting to me because for those of you that have been out on this landscape, there's pueblos and ceramics and all this other stuff, but to find a site that was devoid of that was also very interesting, because as archaeologists, we also like to think of like, why are things absent at this site? And we don't, because this is an open air site, clearly we don't have any of the perishables visible. So we know that it was, basket maker, or that they were making baskets, and it was from this time period just based on the artifacts we found. It's not very often that we find a site that so neatly fits into a definition of a phase. So it was really exciting for me. Alrighty, so our next phase, moving on, is the Cottonwood Phase from 400 to 600 AD. And one of the important aspects, or one of those tipping points for this phase, is the fact that ceramics started coming up into this area from Central America. And so it's this exchange of ideas that we have coming up from Central America, and then this technology is being taught to the people here, because we start seeing locally made ceramics made from local clays and what's called temper. So when you've got your ceramic clay, you have to make some kind of additive to make sure that when the clay is baked, it fuses and it becomes stronger. And we call that additive a temper. And one of the fun things, and if we ever go out to a site, I still haven't found a really good example, but I'm shooting for it, is that when you go out to some of these early sites with ceramics, they didn't quite know what they were doing. And so they were playing around with techniques. And one of the techniques that they used for a while for temper was organic material, which, as you can imagine, when you fire it, all that organic material burns away and you've lost your temper. And then you have this very friable kind of ceramic that doesn't quite hold together very well. And so I've heard rumor that when you go to some of these early sites, you can see that, and you can see where that temper has burned out because they didn't quite get the technology yet. And that kind of changes through time as well, as they're able to figure out how to make that pot stay and be stable. And then another part of this time period is we see shallow pit houses, but they start to become more permanent. A little bit more effort is made into building these pit houses. So you can kind of see here that these pit houses, they're not, and here's an example from Mesa Verde from about the same time period. So yeah, it's farther away, but I wanted to show kind of what it would look like. So as opposed to that UFO shaped, we start seeing more emphasis on digging down, actually having some good walls and building up. And they're just taking a little bit more effort into creating a home for themselves. And once again, we start to see that there's more sedentism, and we see an increase of farming during this time period. And one of the things that's interesting is that we don't have a lot of sites from this time period up on the forest. And, you know, that could be for a variety of reasons, but I don't know, and I would be interested in knowing why. So another thing I wanted to touch with the ceramic manufacturing, I talked about the temper, but there's also a very distinct style of how they created their ceramics. And so the ceramic manufacturing technique that is used in this area is called coil and scrape. And so when you're when you're a little kid or whatever, or playing with your grandkids with Play-Doh, whatever it might be, you know, you roll your little snake and then you kind of coil it around and you coil it up and create a pot. And this is the technique that they were using in this area. Basically throughout the entire time until abandonment, this was a technique they used. So they coiled it and then they would scrape it. They would either use a rock or they would use a broken piece of pottery from a different pot and scrape it and scrape the sides. And often when you're out in the woods, if you see scraping on like the interior of a jar sherd, that's from where they coiled and they scrape, because when they're scraping, sometimes they'll grab some of that temper. So, you know, during this time period, it's organic materials transitioning to sand temper, which is, we have plenty of sand out here. And that's primarily what they would use, is sand temper, sometimes with crushed up volcanic rock, which we also have a lot of up here. And so they would use that, and when they'd use that as temper, and then when they would scrape, sometimes it catches on those little grains of salt or basalt, and you get these kind of these scratches on the inside. So it's really fun to see kind of that little human aspect to it. The other type, the other type of ceramic production or ceramic manufacturing is paddle and anvil. So this is, as opposed to making your coils, this is, you kind of start with a pinch pot. You have a ball of clay, press down the middle, and you pinch around, and you eventually get it bigger and bigger. And then you take your paddle and your anvil, which is going to be a nice smooth rock, and the paddle is going to go on the outside and paddle and help shape what you want your pot to be. And this technique was primarily used in the Hohokam area, as well, which is down in the valley, as well as the Sinagua, which is outside of Flagstaff or around Flagstaff area. They would use this paddle and anvil technique. And sometimes we do find sherds that have been either traded into this area, with this type of manufacturing technique. So it's pretty interesting. So if you're out in the woods, pay attention and you know, look at sherds and kind of check them out and see if they've got that scraping. Or the paddle and anvil is often, you can see the imprints of the paddle on the outside. It doesn't quite follow this idea of a coil and scrape. All right, so next phase. So we're really starting to ramp up a little bit. So the previous phase, not a lot of people are up here. There's just not a lot going on. But the Forestdale phase, which is about 600 to 800 AD, this is where we start to see a lot of changes happening. And it starts to get exciting, I guess you could say. So we see that there's more reliance on farming, and there's an increased occupation along the rim. This was because during this time period, there was the introduction of a new variant of corn. So what they were using before this time period was a smaller, it was smaller. I've got some photos on the next slide I'll show you. It was a smaller type of corn that just, it took a lot to process and a lot to actually maintain. Pardon me. It just took a lot to process it because it was just smaller cob with smaller kernels. But then a new variation of a drought-tolerant maize called Maize Diocho. And I apologize, I don't speak Spanish, so that is not the best pronunciation. But it was not only drought-tolerant, but produced larger cobs, but with less rows than the previous variant. So it's drought-tolerant, it's bigger, and it might have less rows than the previous variant of corn, but they're bigger. And producing more food. So being a drought tolerant variation, they were able to kind of adjust their farming techniques to rely on the seasonal monsoonal pattern that we get up here, in which we're in right now. So yay. So they were able to adjust their farming techniques to take advantage of the monsoonal rains that we get up here that are prevalent throughout the Southwest. And then they in turn have more productive crops. It's also important to note that during this time period, it's kind of a below average precipitation. And so you get an introduction of drought tolerant corn and then a below average precipitation. And you're actually going to be doing just fine because you've got this new type of corn. And some of the indicators that we see that kind of clue us in that they're becoming more invested in farming is we see a change in the style of manos and metates. We see a trough-based, more trough style that you can see here. This little girl is utilizing, and then we also see upright slab storage cisterns and rooms. And then we also see the introduction of early black on white ceramics. And let's see. There we go. So here's some picture I was telling you about. So corn originated from a plant called teosinte down in Southern America. And it was originally thought that it basically evolved through selection, that they would choose those hunter-gatherers down in that area would kind of choose what they liked. And then through time, they kind of manipulated the plant to make what we see here, kind of this intermediates as it's identified here. And so that's kind of how corn evolved. And this is kind of representative of that more drought tolerant corn. Looks a little bit more similar to what we see today versus what they started out with during the late Archaic and these earlier time periods I was talking about. It's a smaller cob. And this is an example. This is a historic photo from the 1930s, but it's an example of kind of the dry farming technique that they would use. And then we have this example of terracing. We also see check dams and these other areas that they've modified to kind of hold in the water to help them farm both the corn and the beans and squash. And then here's an example. Here is an example of a trough metate, and then this two-handed loaf-shaped mono. So we love our bread here as archaeologists. So you've got your bun-shaped mono and your two-handed loaf-shaped mono. And And these this just helped them grind more at a time. And you can just see how well loved and beautiful this is. And there are times on the forest that we'll be out looking at sites, and you will find metates that have been ground until there's like it's a centimeter thick in the bottom of the metate. It's really neat to see how much it was used and loved. And then, as I mentioned before, we start seeing these slab-lined cysts. So it's not visible in this one, but you've got these exterior slabs. But in this one, you've got exterior slabs as well as the floor was slab-lined. A lot of this was basically rodent protection to keep the rodents out. So you would have your pots in there full of food, and then all the slabs would help keep intrusion from the rodents out. We also start seeing these Mogollon brownwares. So we start seeing a little bit more investment once they figured out the temper issue in creating these pots. There's been various theories as to why they would do kind of what we call corrugation on the outside. Sometimes, in this example, you see a couple different types of corrugation, and just on the neck of the jar. Sometimes we'll see it on the entire jar. A couple theories is that it helps when you're trying to grip it to take it off of the fire, that extra friction helps. Or also that the little corrugations hold in heat a little bit better and help heat it up quicker. So those are a couple theories. Of course, I'm not sure which one's true or if either one is true. But that's the joy of archaeology. We can make our best guess. We also start seeing black on white pottery. And here are some examples of some of that pottery. And the way that they make these, it's different than the Mogollon brownware that we just saw, in that they're using a different type of clay, and that the temper is much more fine. So they grind up the temper a little bit more. They're using a different color clay, and they're firing these differently. So they're firing, when they fire these types of pots, these whitewares, they're firing it in an oxidized, reduced atmosphere, which means the pots or the bowls are not exposed to oxygen. They get the fire going, they put the bowls on, and they cover it up with dirt or whatever they have, and they reduce the oxygen that's available to these bowls or pots, and it creates a white color. They would also take clay without the temper and make a glaze, or make a it's a glaze essentially, and they thin out the clay. It's a slip, that's what it is, sorry, it's a slip. They thin out the clay and make a fine slip around the pottery, and it creates this nice it will create this nice white once it's been fired. And one of the other interesting, fun things that I've seen out on the forest, going back to the Rodeo Chetasky fire, because it did burn through a lot of our large areas with our large population centers that were population centers prehistorically. So we see a lot of black on white pottery out there, but in some areas where the fire burned so hot, it actually oxidized the pottery and turned it red. And so when you're out there, you might pick up a piece of pottery and think that it's a redware, but it has a whiteware design on it. And that's what happened, is it was exposed to fire that was so hot that the sherd was exposed to the open air and oxygen, and it became a redware essentially. So once again, maybe something we can go out on a field trip and try and find. So back to this time period during Forestdale, as things are kind of ramping up in the area, we start seeing this whiteware. They're experimenting with that. It's one of my favorite time periods to find whiteware, because you can kind of see they're kind of unsure. You can see the designs are all like, I'm just going to go for it and see if I can make a straight line. And it's just fun to see. And then you can kind of see the development of artistry for the next several hundred years as they kind of fine tune their craft. All right, corduroy phase. So this is interesting because we just talked about kind of this ramp up happening in Forestdale, and we do find sites on the forest from Forestdale, but then during the corduroy time period, it's not really here. We don't have a lot of sites that are just specifically associated with this time period. We know that during this time period across the Southwest, they're intensifying their farming efforts and kind of developing these more substantial villages. But one of the key things during this time period in this area is that we were having below normal precipitation. So it's probably what kept people out, is the fact that the precipitation wouldn't make farming really feasible during that time. So also during this time, outside of this area, we see these small villages of 10 to 25 people, and they're above ground masonry room blocks or pueblos. We see early glazed pottery, which is what I accidentally said earlier, but not right. And then the pottery that's shown here is Kiatutlana, which is very hard to say. So if anybody can pronounce it right, just let me know at the end. So it's very similar to the other pottery that we see from the previous period, in that you have these thin lines. They're not really quite confident lines. And then you see these other geometric features. One of the differences is in the previous, we'll just go back real quick. You can kind of see they're kind of hesitant to use the entire space of the bowl. Whereas with this style, we start to see them kind of encroach and kind of, start hanging designs off the rim and kind of encroach down towards the middle of the bowl. That's a whole other presentation I can give about the changes in designs and ceramics, because that's another thing I really like to research. So also, we continue to see long distance trade with Mesoamerica. It's clear that Mesoamerica is truly influencing the Southwest at this point, with the introduction of the bow and arrow, the introduction of corn, and then the introduction of the drought resistant corn. So there's a lot of influence from Mesoamerica. Okay, Dry Valley. So Forestdale was exciting. Dry Valley starts to get really exciting. And that's because we start seeing people move into this area. We see a spike happening, and that the population is kind of starting to ramp up. And it's more people are coming into the area than we have evidence of there being previously. And we start seeing pit house hamlets or villages start forming. So hamlets are more of those group of 10 to 20 people. Villages are going to be a little bit bigger, maybe 25 to 50 people. So we start seeing these pit house hamlets and villages kind of coming together. And we also start seeing an additional style of pottery, which is my favorite type of style up in this area. And that's called red mesa black on white. The Kiatutlana is also still present during this time period, but then the red mesa black on white kind of creeps in. And one of the reasons why I really like this pottery, it's got these really cool interlocking spirals that I just think are really neat. And it's a design that you see throughout the Southwest. And I love that you can see those different influences. And speaking towards that, there's a lot of, with our whitewares and our pottery designs here in this area, a lot of them are being influenced from the ancestral Puebloan Four Corners region. So we might have the same exact design on pottery down here, but we call it something different because what the ceramic is made of is different. So when they're using these local clays and these local tempers, we refer to it as something different versus what they might refer to it in the Four Corners region. So if you go up to Blanding and say go to the Edge of the Cedars Museum, they have a lot of pottery, black and white pottery that's the same design but called something completely different. And that's because they are sharing these ideas and they're kind of crossing those boundaries and being influenced by those different designs and ideas. Let's see, I think I have covered everything there. All right, so now we come to a really cool time period, and that's the Carrizo phase. And there's a lot to go over and not enough time or slides to do it. And this is where it's just really neat what's going on during this time period. It's a super exciting time. We've got people moving in, just gobs of people moving in, and there's a lot of outside forces happening during this time period. So we've got this mass migration into the area, and then we see the development of the existing pit house hamlets and villages. They start to increase. Their sizes start increasing. And kind of the migration of people in this area start kind of encompassing that and intermingling with that. And this is kind of where we really start to see the development of the melting pot of the Mogollon culture really take hold. So we've kind of seen it in different influences, but now we are really truly seeing it in what we've got up here. So we have pit house villages, but we also start seeing above ground multi-room blocks, as well as field houses. So field houses are like these one-room rooms that are maybe 1 or 2 courses high, and then they have built up adobe and like kind of a wattle and daub structure for them to either store their harvest or to hang out there when they're watching the fields and keep their fields safe from rabbits and other things. We also see other intensifications of farming activities. We have check dams pretty much in all the arable washes throughout the area they used for farming. So I want to step back. I talked a little bit in the beginning about architecture, and when we start seeing these multi-room blocks, it's very interesting because they're heavily influenced from the room blocks and styles that we see in the Four Corners area, with some of this Mogollon kind of style. So the traditional Mogollon architecture was made from basically cobbles, is how they created their walls. Was this cobbles was the primary way that they created their pueblos or their architecture, or around the pit houses or whatever it may be. Well, in this area, we see mix. We see cobbles being used, but we also see shaped sandstone and basalt being used, and not quite in the same style that we see architecture down in, say, the Alpine area and south of Alpine and on the Gila National Forest right next door. Although we all call them Mogollon, the architecture is really being influenced from the Four Corners region. And one of the, okay, we'll get to that in a second, but I think it was very interesting to know of how heavily influenced the architecture is being from the Four Corners region. And I'm going to speak to this slide real quick, and then we'll move on because I want to kind of explain why I think that's happening. But also during this time, we see an increased variety of ceramics, including the introduction of redwares. And so here are some examples of the redwares we got. These are Sholo redwares. So what I was talking about earlier with the whitewares, these redwares were fired in an oxidized environment, meaning at some point in time with their firing, they were exposed to oxygen, and it created this red color. And they also have a slip. And with Sholo whitewares, it's very washy. So you can kind of see, it's kind of hard to see, but it's kind of very worn out and kind of washy, and you can't really it's not a really thick slip. So, but we see this development, and we see the majority of all of our redwares are going to be some kind of bowl. This is an example of a ladle, but it's a bowl and then it's got a handle. So some kind of, they really focus their designs on the interior of the bowl itself. All right, so back to our architecture and what in the world is going on, because I just wanted to touch on that first. So during this same time period, we see a ramping up. It's kind of the fluorescence of Chaco Canyon. And so we start to really see this influence of Chaco Canyon entering this area. And we see that through the development of Great Kivas. And they kind of play a key role in the communities here. And part of the reason that Kivas are such an important part of this area is during this time, as I said, you have an influx of all these people coming in from, we don't quite know where. I can tell you that, before this time period up in southern Utah, they developed redwares. And, I kind of have this hypothesis that we see an abandonment during Pueblo 1 of these people leaving the area who had developed these redwares. And I really think that they came down here and kind of started interacting with the people down here, or some kind of transmission of ideas of this redware. And so you start getting these people from different areas, and you kind of need something to help your community kind of be cohesive. And so we start seeing Great Kivas pop up in this area, and they play a key role in creating cohesiveness within your group. And so we're going to go into Kivas a little bit more, some Great Kivas a little bit more, but I wanted to also talk about, so you've got people coming to this area. We have the fluorescence of Chaco Canyon that's just, booming and grooving out there. And at the same time, in this area, the climate is wonderful. There's beginning to be an increase in rain and snowfall. So precipitation is really high and a really great place to come and to farm and to be able to sustain a large population. Because also during this time, we've got a series of volcanic eruptions. Basically, the I-40 corridor from the San Francisco Peaks in Flagstaff, and you've got Sunset Crater that erupted during this time period. And you also have take I-40 across to New Mexico and Grants, New Mexico, outside of south of Mount Taylor. You've got El Malpai and all of the lava flows from there. So you've got this kind of disruption happening. So where are people going to go? They're going to go where there's water, and so and a way to sustain and have life. And so word got around, and they started coming to this area. So it's kind of my theory also as to the outside pressures that are happening that are kind of causing people to kind of hone in on this area and to develop a large community. Because during this time period, thousands of people lived in this area, thousands. We have so many archaeological resources that date to this time period. It's just thousands of people have influxed into the area. And so what are you going to do when you have all that people? You've got to develop cohesiveness, and the Great Kivas, those ceremonial structures really played a key role in keeping the communities cohesive. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit of characteristics of Great Kivas. They are these large structures, ritualistic structures, ceremonial structures that played a key role in kind of in our day and age. It's like churches, or it's like communal structures. It's like the senior center. It's like a community rec center type of thing, a place where people can all go together and share in some kind of activity. So Great Kivas evolved or come from Chaco Canyon. That's where the idea of them evolved. And that's where we see this idea and this origin going out to other areas. And a side note I want to point out is we are the southwesternmost representation of kivas throughout the Southwest. We're kind of like the title of Sarah Herr's book, that we're kind of this frontier of great kivas. And so some of the characteristics of a great kiva that you see in Chaco Canyon is that you've got a large central hearth. And I tried to get some good pictures, but they're not that great. But you've got a large central hearth, which is right here. And then you've got a sipapu, which is a small hole that's located north of this large hearth. And that is believed to represent the entrance from the underworld, where the ancestors of the ancestral Puebloans were born, and where they came through into this world. And so that's the sipapu is a key component to any kiva that you will see, whether it's a small kiva, which we'll talk about, or a great kiva. The sipapu is that main component that's going to clue you in that this is an important ceremonial place for the ancestral Puebloans or the Mogollon. Other characteristics that we see, in Chaco Canyon is these are called foot drums. There's a couple theories that there was some kind of hide, some kind of animal hide that they would stretch across these foot drums, and then they were able to drum them and make a sound, and it was important to the ceremony. This is all speculation. I'm not quite sure if it's true or not, but they are referred to as foot drums. Benches are also very important. You'll also, when people have excavated great kivas, they'll often find ceremonial artifacts on these benches. Also, there's a couple people in this photo for scale, so you can just see just how big these are. These are huge and could hold a lot of people. Also, other kind of practical characteristics is you will have, these are post holes. These are very large post holes that were used to stabilize the roof. In this case, the roof was probably 100% covered. And the great kivas in Chaco Canyon, they vary in size from about 34 to 63 feet in diameter. And then they were also very deep. These are very deep as well. So my guess is, they're 6, 7, 8 feet deep at least. So these are the characteristics of the great kivas that we see in Chaco Canyon. The ones that we see in the Mogollon Rim area are a little bit different. So just to give you an idea, across where the Black Mesa and the Lakeside districts, we have at least 14 known great kivas. There might be more out there. We do have other kivas that are smaller that I'll talk about here in a little bit, but great kivas is basically anything that is 30 feet or more in diameter. And it's interesting because the diameter of kivas that we have in this area actually are larger than what we see at Chaco Canyon. The only difference is they're much shallower. And so what the diameter that we see in this area is about 60 to 70 feet. And it has similar characteristics to the great kivas that we see in Chaco Canyon. They have a central hearth, a sipapu, we've got benches, and then the 4 large roof supporting posts. And there's a lot of theories. I'm not sure if the kivas here were completely covered or not. Or if it was, for example, right here, we have an example of a partial roofing with an entryway. And then this would be what the cribbing roofing would look like if it was completely covered. And then here's a cross section of kind of what we see for a typical great kiva in the Mogollon area. You can see that it is shallower and it's not it's just not, it doesn't have the depth that those kivas in Chaco Canyon have. So that's kind of what we're dealing with the Great Kivas that we have over here. Here's just an example. This is just an example of a smaller circular kiva that I threw up there. It's a little bit more simple and less ornate than what you see at Chaco Canyon. You do have your sipapu right here, and your hearth. And this is from a top entry kind of style kiva. So the Great Kivas that we see here, they don't have the foot drums. Sometimes they have benches. Sometimes it's not clear if they have benches or not. So it's a very interesting thing that our kivas here are bigger, but they're more shallow, and they don't have all the characteristics of what we see at Chaco Canyon. So I think that it's likely that not only were these Great Kivas used for a ritual space, but also for like communal gatherings, and not necessarily 100% ritual or ceremonial that we probably saw in Chaco Canyon, or what they were probably used in Chaco Canyon. So one of the other characteristics that we see with these Great Kiva sites on the forest is that you have your Great Kiva. I really like this photo. This is from the front of Sarah Herr's Mogollon Kivas along the Mogollon Rim book, just to kind of reconstruct what this Great Kiva might have looked like that's up in this area. You've got your 4 posts, and just the sheer size of these kivas are pretty incredible. A lot of dirt was moved. And then here's an example of a kiva that's been collapsed and, is completely covered. But you can see just how high the walls are, and this deep indentation. But another characteristic that we see in the Mogollon Rim is that these kivas, you've got a Great Kiva, then you always have some kind of room block associated with it. And sometimes these room blocks are only like 4 rooms. Other times they're like 10, 15, 20, 30 rooms. It just depends on what room block or what kiva you're at. But there's always a room block associated with it, always a Great Kiva. And then you always have a midden. The midden tends to be northeast of the kivas, but it really depends on topography. But those are the 3 characteristics that you will always see at every single Great Kiva site that we have on the forest. So it's pretty interesting to see that. There is one site, it's a Great Kiva, but then you've got like 3 or 4 different room blocks as well. So it's variable, but there will always be a Great Kiva, room block, and midden. So kind of what I mentioned before, we're still, a lot of work was done in the early 90s, but we've added a lot of data since then. And so we're still kind of working on compiling that data and really helping create a story of, these Great Kivas, they also served communities, and how many people were they serving? What is the reach of their community, and what is the boundary between this Great Kiva and their community versus another Great Kiva in that community? A side note, with these room blocks, it's been hypothesized that either the caretaker of the kiva or the shaman or the person kind of in charge of these events was likely living in the room block itself. Okay. Yes, I'm not sure how much time I have, Richard, so I'm almost done, so don't worry if I'm running out of time. All right, so then we get to the late Carrizo phase, which is about 1150 to 1200 AD. And there is a massive shift in ideology at this time, because by 1150 AD, Chaco Canyon had collapsed. It was no longer flourishing. People had started abandoning the area, and it had collapsed. And we start seeing this reflected in we start seeing this kind of change of ideology reflected in the architecture and what's going on in this area as well. So we start seeing an abandonment of the Great Kivas in this area during this time period, and they start creating kind of smaller rectangular kivas or communal structures. So they're kind of condensing that ideology and not utilizing these large Great Kiva sites. And so we also see that they are starting to they're starting to change how they're living as well. So in this picture right here, we see these pit houses, but we also see these above ground room blocks. So they're starting to do that, and they're starting to kind of aggregate just a little bit more than what they were, because when they had during the Great Kiva time period, they're all spread out. They're all spread out all over the ridges and all over the valleys in this area. And now they're kind of starting to compress a little bit, which is probably because there was probably some tension. If you've got Chaco Canyon collapsing and we've got all these Great Kivas over there, so they probably ascribed to some kind of belief that those in Chaco Canyon did, and it's collapsed. And so now they're kind of pulling away and drawing away from that belief system. So we also see during this time period the development of what's called White Mountain redwares. So this is a locally made redware, and the biggest difference between the Sholo redware that I described to you before is this White Mountain redware dabbles with polychrome. As you can see, we've got both black and white paint, but it also has a slip that is extremely thick. So if you were to break that pot and look at it, you could see the outline of the slip, and it's very obvious and very thick. So we've kind of started seeing this population go down a little bit. And then this is the Linden phase. So during the Linden phase, from about 1200 to 1275 AD, we start seeing them even more come together and aggregate. So they're aggregating in these smaller communities. They're not smaller. Sorry, excuse me, I misread my notes. They start to aggregate, and we see large surface masonry pueblos of up to about 100 rooms. So this would be like Sholo ruin type size. So Sholo ruin is just off of Sholo Creek where McDonald's is right now. So they're aggregating to areas where they have access to water, but they're kind of coming together. And there's a couple different reasons for this. Like I said earlier, during the late Carrizo, we see Chaco, the collapse of Chaco, and it's kind of the shock waves of that downfall of a social organization. They're kind of possibly being forced together as groups for protection. And also at this time, we see the development of the Kachina ceremonialism. So that is it's a kind of another way. So we talked earlier about Great Kivas acting as a bonding force and social cohesion. And when that collapsed, something needs to kind of replace it to continue to create that bond, especially in this area, because you have such a melting pot and all these different people kind of coming together in this transference of ideas, that we start kind of seeing the Kachina ceremonialism taking hold in this area. And that kind of helps develop that cohesion that we see, or that is happening during that time. Let's see. Also, it could be that there's also kind of resource depression. They were so spread out that they kind of depleted all the resources across. So they had to kind of come together and work together more as a group to, get these resources to be able to survive. Also during this time period, there is a fluctuation of climate. And during the end of this time period is when we start to see what archaeologists call the Great Drought. And it kind of starts around 1276 AD and goes to about 1300 AD. So we're just on the cusp of that, and that change in climate that's really going to influence them and how they're living. And once again, we also see a distinct change in ceramics. We start seeing redwares that have designs on the outside, as well as we see the different types of paint that they're using. It's more of a mineral-based paint versus what they were using in the beginning as organic-based paint. But once again, I could go, it would take me another 3 hours to talk about, so I will hurry it up. And then lastly, nope. sorry, there's 2 more phases. I promise I'm almost done. So then we see the Pinedale phase, which is about 1275 to 1325 AD. This is where we start to see this great drought kind of happening. And it's kind of the beginning of the end in this area. Groups begin to gather into even larger areas. And we get sites like Bailey Ruin, which is our largest pueblo in the forest, consisting of 200, 250 rooms. We still see kivas. There are kivas at Bailey Ruin, and there's actually a couple of them, but they're smaller rectangular kivas. If you go to Petrified Forest and go to Puerco Pueblo, you can actually see an excavated square kiva, or rectangular kiva, pardon me. And you can kind of see it's much smaller, and it's not serving a large number of people. And most of these pueblos are located in large, well-watered meadows with open pine forests where they can be farming and have a decent amount of water. You know, around 1300 is when we see things start to normalize with the climate. I would definitely say that during this time period, there's a lot of social pressures that influence this gathering. There's a possibility of more mobile groups, such as the Athabascans, which are the forefathers of the Apache and the Navajo, coming into this area. And there is evidence that they might have been coming into this area at that time. So people gathering into and aggregating into these large pueblos could also be for defensive reasons. I think I have a picture. There we go. So this is the digital reconstruction of what Bailey Ruin might have looked like. It's pretty neat. If you guys ever want to do a field trip out there, I know several of you probably have already gone out there or are site stewards for it, but I'd gladly take you guys out there and check it out, because you've got this really great plaza area and then all of these rooms. And then the the smaller kivas, there's actually one located right here and one right in this area. And then here's a plan map of it. So it's a pretty incredible place, and pretty amazing, what they were able to build out there. I just threw this in here. This kind of represents kind of throughout time as well of things that they were trading from Mesoamerica. So turquoise, cocoa beans, macaw feathers, copper bells, all find that in the archaeological record. Cocoa beans and macaw feathers, not so much out in the open sites, but within cave sites. Okay, so our last phase is Canyon Creek. It's from 1325 to 1385, and this is where we see a mass abandonment of this area. People just are leaving. They're going to areas north like Snowflake to 4 Mile Ruin, which is another very large pueblo. They're going north there, and then there's also evidence that they move south off the rim to Grasshopper Pueblo. There was a drought during this time. Whether or not it was bad enough that they had to move, I don't know. So the actual pressures that kind of move them off the rim, not quite sure about, and more research is needed. But we do see them moving and aggregating even more in these bigger pueblos. And here is the 4 Mile Ruin polychrome pottery style that we see outside of Snowflake. I included it because it's my favorite pottery style of all time, mainly because who couldn't love that wonderful face. And then lastly, I just want to thank you guys for this opportunity to present, and I'll have a few minutes for questions. But I wanted to let you guys know as well that there's a volunteer opportunity. So me and the other archaeologist over here, as well as our forest archaeologist, hopefully if she can make it, we'll be hosting our 5th annual Passport in Time project, where we'll be out recording sites. I know several of you on this presentation or on this call have gone and done this program. Right now I have 4 spots available. There might be more, but I'm just not quite sure about what my capacity looks like with my permanent folks and vehicles. So if you're interested, please give me a shout out and I'll get you on the list. And I think Deb is on the call even, so she's right there. Deb is learning all about ceramics. So we definitely would love to have you guys out there with us. Just let me know. And with that, thank you for listening. I could have gone on for another couple hours because it's so fascinating and interesting up here. But if anybody has questions, please feel free to ask away.
Well, I sure enjoyed your presentation. You went over an awful lot, and you definitely explained the timeline and the different pottery styles. That was very excellent.
It's fun, and there's so much, and I was hoping to really whittle it down a little bit more and focus on the Carrizo phase, but not enough time. So next time.
Thank you so much. It was so interesting.
It was really fascinating. Thanks.
Thanks, Max.
One thing, if I may hop in here, that you mentioned about the relationship with Chaco and some of these outliers. Martin, Ronaldo, and Longacre back in 1960 excavated there at Wienema, north of Springerville, the Hooper Ranch Pueblo, and they note in their report that the brickwork, if you'd call it that, is Chaco.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, there's physical evidence there in how they built these structures of some relationship right down to the brickwork.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really fascinating because you've got this smattering of great pueblos all across that area. And we even see great pueblos all the way down in the blue south of Alpine. The one south of Alpine, the architecture is not the same as that Chacoan architecture because it reflects more of a Mogollon architecture style, but the Great Kivas is still the same. But I'd definitely be interested in reading that because I know that's one thing I've been trying to pinpoint is we know we have Great Kivas and they're associated with Chaco Canyon over here, but is the architectural design the same as what you're referring to at that site as well as what we see at Chaco?
Well,
so that's another vein.
Yeah, it's a later era, 1200 roughly, Kiva there. It's the one where they found the water god, Panayoikasi, buried in it.
Mm-hmm.
But they did note that the construction of it, they used the same, techniques and materials and so forth as they did at Chaco. So I'll forward that report from the Field Museum here in Chicago to you.
That would be great. I would love to see that.
Yeah. You'll get it tomorrow.
Excellent. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank Sara because we called upon her at the last minute to put this presentation together for us. And I just think it's really marvelous that you did that.
Thank you. I enjoyed pulling it together. It was a lot of fun. So
Great.
Well, it looked like you spent a lot of time on it. So yes, thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, it was an older presentation that I revamped and actually added a lot more information. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity as well. So it's always good to see familiar names. And yeah, I enjoy hanging out with you guys, even if it's virtual.
Yes, we're going to have to get back to in-house meetings sometime soon.
Yeah.
We're not there yet, I don't think, but we're right close to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. All right. Well, if there's not any questions or if questions come up, you guys have my email. It's right there. And yeah, feel free to email me if you have any other questions or observations, because I'm always willing to learn from you guys as well. So.
All right.
Thank you again.
With that, we'll go ahead and end the Zoom meeting. And thanks to everybody for joining us. It was a great presentation.